Tonight, we begin with a question that'll make your morning commute feel like a vacation. What if you woke up tomorrow, not in your climate-controlled bedroom, but on the scorching banks of the Nile River circa 1300 BCE? Tasked with building a monument that would outlast civilizations? Forget the mystical Hollywood version of ancient Egypt with its noble architects and willing workers blessed by benevolent gods. The real story of building the pyramids, temples, and tombs that still dominate Egypt's landscape is soaked in sweat, blood, and a level of organized human exploitation that would make modern labor unions weep into their coffee. Picture this. You're standing barefoot on limestone dust so fine it's already working its way into your lungs with every breath. The sun hammering down with temperatures regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're about to spend the next 4 months hauling blocks of stone that weigh as much as a modern sedan using technology that wouldn't look out of place in a caveman's toolkit. You're not some noble architect or high priest. You're a conscripted laborer, plucked from your farming village during the Nile's flood season when your fields are underwater and you're considered available for national service. Your pharaoh has decided that his eternal resting place requires another massive temple complex, and you've been volunteered to make it happen. No unions, no safety equipment, no workers' compensation, no 8-hour workday, and certainly no air-conditioned break rooms with vending machines. Just you, several thousand other desperate souls, and an engineering challenge that would give modern construction firms nightmares, even with their hydraulic cranes and computer modeling. The overseers are already shouting, the first stone is waiting to be moved, and you haven't even had breakfast yet. Though calling it breakfast would be generous, considering what's waiting for you in that clay bowl. Your Hollywood dreams of mysterious Egyptian wisdom and noble purpose are about to be crushed more thoroughly than the limestone beneath your bleeding feet. Because the reality of building for eternity means a daily grind that most people today couldn't survive past lunch. The sun's climbing higher. The foreman's copper-tipped whip is catching the light. And you're about to learn why ancient Egyptian builders had an average life expectancy that makes medieval peasants look like longevity champions. Welcome to your new reality, where every sunrise brings fresh agony and every sunset, if you survive to see it, brings you one day closer to being buried in the very monuments you're breaking your body to create. Let's ease into tonight's journey together and discover exactly why you'd be begging for your desk job back before the morning shift even ended. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe so you'll always know when a new one is uploaded. And I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Your first morning begins at an hour that would make even the most ambitious fitness influencer reconsider their life choices. Approximately 4:30 in the morning, when the sky is still more black than blue and the Nile mists are thick enough to taste. There's no alarm clock, of course, just the rhythmic bang of copper rods against bronze gongs, a sound that echoes across the workers' camp with all the gentle subtlety of a concussion grenade. You're sleeping on a reed mat in a mud brick barracks that houses 200 other men, and the smell alone would violate several Geneva Conventions if they existed. Which they don't, because you're living in an era where human rights are still about 3,000 years away from being invented. The air inside is thick with the collective body odor of exhausted men who haven't bathed properly in weeks, mixed with the sour smell of yesterday's onions and the acrid tang of urine from the overflowing waste trenches outside. Your sleeping mat is infested with fleas that have been feasting on you all night, leaving your skin dotted with angry red welts that itch with an intensity that makes you want to claw your own flesh off. But there's no time for scratching, no time for groaning about your aching muscles from yesterday's labor, no time for the basic human dignity of waking up slowly and gathering your thoughts. The moment that gong sounds, you're expected to be on your feet, because the overseers don't care if you're injured, sick, or literally dying. If you're breathing, you're working. You stumble outside into the pre-dawn darkness with the rest of your barracks, joining a shuffling mass of humanity that looks more like a zombie apocalypse than a construction crew. Everyone's moving with the mechanical precision of people who've learned that hesitation means punishment. And punishment here doesn't mean a stern talking to or a written warning for your employee file. The overseers carry copper-tipped whips, wooden clubs, and absolutely zero patience for workers who don't immediately comply with orders. You've already witnessed what happens to slow movers. Yesterday, you watched a man take 5 strikes across his back for stopping to catch his breath while hauling rope. And the sound of leather on flesh is now permanently burned into your memory banks. The darkness is barely starting to lift as you join the queue for breakfast, which is a generous term for what you're about to receive. A cook with dead eyes and mechanical movements slops a ladle of barely warm gruel into your clay bowl, a mixture of emmer wheat porridge that's been watered down to the consistency of paste, with a few token pieces of onion floating in it like sad little life rafts. This is your fuel for the next 6 hours of backbreaking labor, roughly 300 calories that wouldn't sustain a modern office worker through their morning emails, let alone someone about to move rocks that weigh more than refrigerators. You squat in the dust with your fellow workers, everyone eating in grim silence because talking wastes time and energy, both of which are in desperately short supply. The gruel tastes like wet cardboard mixed with dirt, with an occasional crunch that's either grit or weevils. At this point, you don't even bother determining which, because extra protein is extra protein when you're slowly starving. Around you, the camp is coming to life with all the warmth of a prison yard, which essentially is what this is. A massive labor camp disguised as a royal building project, where thousands of men are held captive not by chains, but by duty, debt, and the knowledge that refusing to work means their families back home lose their land allotments and starve. By 5:30 in the morning, you're already at your assigned workstation, which is a generous term for a particular patch of hellish terrain where you'll spend the next 4 months hauling stone blocks from the quarry to the construction site. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but the temperature is already climbing past 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can feel the heat building like an oven that someone forgot to turn off. Your team consists of 20 other men, most of whom look as thrilled about the day ahead as death row inmates heading to their execution. And you've been assigned to move a single limestone block that measures approximately 4 feet by 4 feet by 6 feet and weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 tons. For context, that's roughly the weight of a modern pickup truck. And you're expected to move it using rope, wooden sledges, and the raw muscle power of desperate men who are already malnourished and exhausted before the workday even begins. The block is currently sitting in the quarry, which is a massive scar in the landscape where workers have been cutting limestone from the living rock for the past 3 years, creating a wound in the earth that looks like the gods themselves took a bite out of the desert. The quarry echoes with the constant sound of copper chisels striking stone, a rhythmic clanging that sounds like 1,000 blacksmiths working in perfect unison. And the air is so thick with limestone dust that breathing feels like inhaling ground glass. You can see workers deeper in the quarry, their skin turned completely white from the dust, looking like ghosts laboring in their own tombs. And you realize with growing horror that you'll probably look exactly like them by lunchtime. The foreman, a thick-necked brute who earned his position by being too cruel for regular labor, barks orders that you're only beginning to understand because you're still learning the specific jargon of construction work. He's pointing at your block, then at wooden rollers scattered nearby, then at the construction site roughly half a mile away, where the temple is slowly rising from the desert floor. The mathematics of your situation are brutally simple. You need to move 2.5 tons of stone half a mile using technology that's barely evolved past the Stone Age. And you need to do it before the sun reaches its zenith and turns this entire landscape into a giant tandoori oven. Your team gathers around the block like a group of climbers contemplating Everest. And someone produces thick ropes made from twisted papyrus reeds that look about as trustworthy as wet shoelaces. These ropes will be looped around the stone block, with wooden beams inserted through the loops to create handles. And then you'll all grab onto these beams and start pulling like a team of human oxen. There's no sophisticated engineering here. No mechanical advantage beyond the simple inclined plane. No recognition that human bodies have limits that shouldn't be exceeded daily. Just raw force applied by expendable workers in service of a monument that will outlast your great-great-great-grandchildren. The overseer is already walking up and down the line of workers, copper-tipped whip tapping against his palm in a rhythm that suggests he's eager to use it. And you realize that hesitation or weakness will be met with immediate violence. Around you, other teams are already hauling their stones, the desert floor echoing with the grinding sound of limestone on wooden sledges, punctuated by the occasional crack of a whip and the resulting cry of pain. This is your new normal. And the sun hasn't even fully risen yet. The actual mechanics of moving your stone block involve a level of physical coordination and suffering that would make a CrossFit instructor look like a gentle yoga teacher. First, your team has to maneuver thick papyrus ropes under and around the block, which means several men have to lie on their sides in the limestone dust and try to thread the rope through the narrow gap between stone and ground, while the overseer screams encouragement in the form of detailed threats about what happens to lazy workers. The ropes are rough enough to shred skin on contact, and within minutes your hands are already developing blisters that will pop, bleed, and get infected with the kind of bacterial enthusiasm that modern antibiotics could handle. But your immune system absolutely cannot. Once the ropes are positioned, wooden beams are threaded through the loops to create handles. Long poles that look like they were cut from trees and given the absolute minimum amount of processing before being declared good enough for government work. You and 9 other men grab one beam, while 10 more grab the opposite beam. And on the count of 3, everyone is expected to lift simultaneously while screaming like you're trying to intimidate the stone into cooperating. The physics of this moment are absolutely brutal. You're essentially trying to deadlift 250 pounds per person while standing on unstable ground, with inadequate leverage, using a grip that's already compromised by your bleeding hands. Your back immediately protests with a shooting pain that suggests your spine is seriously reconsidering its participation in this whole enterprise. Your legs shake with the effort of keeping your body upright. And somewhere in your abdomen, something makes a popping sensation that you desperately hope is just a muscle and not something more catastrophic. The stone lifts maybe 6 inches off the ground, enough for other workers to frantically shove wooden sledge runners underneath. And then you're lowering it with a thud that reverberates through the ground and into your already aching joints. Phase 1 complete, and you've moved the stone exactly 0 feet toward its destination, while expending enough energy to power a modern human through an entire workday. Now comes the actual hauling, which involves your entire team positioning themselves along the ropes, digging your feet into the sand and limestone dust, and pulling with every ounce of strength your malnourished body can generate. The overseer takes his position to the side, whip ready, and begins a rhythmic chant that coordinates the pulling, a call and response that would be almost musical if it wasn't accompanying such misery. On the count, everyone pulls, and the massive stone block begins to move with a grinding sound that's like fingernails on a chalkboard amplified through a megaphone. You're pulling so hard that your vision starts to blur at the edges. Your feet are sliding backward in the dust, even as you try to maintain purchase. And the rope is cutting into your shoulders with enough force that you can feel it grinding against bone. The block slides forward exactly 3 feet before momentum stops. You have to reset for the next pull. 3 feet. You've moved 3 feet. You have roughly 2,600 feet to go before this particular stone reaches its final destination. The mathematics of this situation are starting to become horrifyingly clear. At 3 feet per pull, you're looking at roughly 800 pulls to complete this journey. And each pull is consuming approximately 2 minutes when you factor in the reset time. That's over 26 hours of continuous pulling. And you haven't even accounted for the fact that the human body can't sustain this level of effort without breaking down catastrophically. But the overseer doesn't care about your mathematical projections or your body's limitations. He cares about that stone reaching the construction site before the sun sets, and he'll whip every man on this team into hamburger if that's what it takes to meet his quota. By hour 3 of your stone hauling marathon, the sun has risen high enough to begin its daily mission of turning every living thing in Egypt into beef jerky. And the temperature has climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for rocket launches. Your body is producing sweat at a rate that would impress a marathon runner. But unlike modern athletes who have access to sports drinks and electrolyte replacement, you're losing salt and minerals that won't be adequately replaced by anything available in ancient Egypt's limited nutritional offerings. The water situation is particularly grim. There are large ceramic jars stationed at intervals along the work route, theoretically providing hydration for the workers. But the reality is that hundreds of men are sharing these same jars, dipping their cupped hands or clay cups into water that's already been contaminated by everyone else's bodily fluids, dust, and the occasional dead insect. Every sip you take is a gamble with dysentery, and the odds are not in your favor considering that intestinal parasites are so common among Egyptian workers that having worms is basically considered normal. You can see the effects of dehydration and heat exhaustion playing out in real time among your fellow workers, men stumbling as they pull, their movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated, their skin taking on a grayish pallor that suggests their bodies are starting to shut down non-essential systems to preserve core functions. Someone in the team behind you collapses face first into the limestone dust. his body going completely limp mid-pull. And you expect work to stop while he receives medical attention because surely even ancient Egyptians recognized that dying workers can't move stones. But you've severely overestimated the value placed on individual human life in this era. 2 workers simply drag the collapsed man off to the side of the route like he's a piece of broken equipment. Leave him in whatever small shadow they can find, and immediately rejoin their team to continue pulling. The overseer doesn't even acknowledge the incident beyond a brief glance to confirm the stone is still moving. Because a single worker going down is just the normal cost of doing business in Bronze Age construction. Your own body is starting to send increasingly urgent distress signals that you lack the luxury of acknowledging. There's a stabbing pain in your lower back that suggests something has been pulled or strained beyond its design specifications. Your hands have progressed beyond blisters into open wounds where the rope has literally worn through the skin. And your shoulders feel like they're being slowly dislocated from their sockets with each pull. The wooden beam you're gripping is now slick with blood from multiple workers' hands, creating a biohazard grip that would violate every OSHA regulation ever written if OSHA existed in 1300 BCE. Around you, the construction site is a vision of hell that would make Dante take notes. Hundreds of similar teams hauling stones across the burning sand, the air filled with the grinding of rock on wood, the crack of whips, the groans of suffering men, and the occasional scream when someone's injury crosses the threshold from merely agonizing to catastrophically debilitating. Dust hangs in the air like a permanent fog, coating everyone and everything in a fine white powder that gets into your lungs with each breath, and you can feel it accumulating in your throat and nasal passages like your body is being slowly fossilized from the inside out. The half-mile journey that seemed manageable at dawn has transformed into an endless odyssey, where every 3 feet of progress requires selling another piece of your physical well-being. And you're not even halfway to the construction site yet. The construction site itself is organized chaos on a scale that would make modern project managers weep into their Gantt charts. And as your team finally drags your stone block into this madhouse around noon, you get your first real look at the monument you're literally bleeding to create. The temple complex is a massive work in progress, with walls already rising 30 feet high in some sections, creating a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that seem designed to confuse the gods themselves into granting the pharaoh eternal life. Hundreds of stones are arriving simultaneously from multiple quarry sites, creating a traffic jam of human suffering that requires its own dedicated team of overseers to manage. And these supervisors stand on elevated wooden platforms, screaming directions that are immediately drowned out by the ambient noise of thousands of men working in proximity. Your specific stone is destined for a section of wall on the temple's northern side, which means navigating through the construction site's treacherous terrain while other teams are dropping stones, moving scaffolding, and generally creating hazards that would make a modern safety inspector have a mental breakdown. The ground is littered with limestone chips, broken tools, discarded rope, and the occasional pool of blood from previous accidents that nobody's bothered to clean up, because worker injury isn't just common, it's expected, budgeted for, and completely normalized in ancient Egyptian construction culture. You pass teams building ramps from mud brick and rubble. These temporary structures are how stones get lifted to higher levels, since pulleys won't be common construction tools for another 1,000 years. And you can see workers hauling stones up these ramps using the same brutal rope and muscle technique you've been employing all morning. Except now they're doing it on an incline that would challenge modern climbers. Men are sweating, bleeding, and occasionally falling off these ramps when exhaustion or heat stroke compromises their balance. And the screams of workers plummeting 20 or 30 feet onto stone floors creates a soundtrack of horror that everyone simply ignores, because acknowledging it would mean confronting the reality that you could be next. Your team finally reaches your designated spot, and a different overseer. Apparently, there's a whole hierarchy of stone placement specialists. Inspects your block with the critical eye of someone judging a beauty pageant for rocks. He's checking that the stone meets specifications, that it hasn't been damaged during transport, and that your team hasn't accidentally brought the wrong block to the wrong location, because apparently that happens enough to require verification. After what feels like an eternity of examination, he nods approval and points to the exact position where this particular piece of limestone will spend the next 3,000 years. And you realize with exhausting certainty that the hardest part is still ahead. Actually lifting this monster into its final resting place. The stone needs to be elevated approximately 6 feet to match the current wall height, which means using a combination of ramps, levers, and what can only be described as controlled falling with extra steps. Other teams are already demonstrating the technique nearby. They drag stones up mud brick ramps, then use wooden levers and smaller stones as fulcrums to tilt and shift the blocks into position, with dozens of men pushing, pulling, and generally risking catastrophic injury to achieve precise placement. You've watched modern construction workers use cranes to place stones with millimeter precision, while enjoying climate-controlled cab comfort and union-mandated brakes. And now, you're about to accomplish the same task, using technology your ancestors would have recognized from 10,000 years earlier. The afternoon sun is absolutely merciless at this point. The temperature has climbed past 115 degrees, and your body is running on pure adrenaline and the fear of what the overseers will do if you fail to complete your assignment before the workday ends. The lunch break arrives like a merciful execution. You're released from active stone hauling, but you're too destroyed to actually enjoy the respite. And the meal you're about to receive makes your morning gruel look like a Michelin-starred breakfast in comparison. The workers gather in whatever shade they can find, mostly the shadows cast by partially completed walls or temporary canvas awnings that provide psychological relief more than actual cooling. And the food distribution begins with all the efficiency of a prison cafeteria, staffed by people who genuinely hate the inmates. You're handed a flat loaf of bread that's so coarse it could double as sandpaper, made from emmer wheat that's been ground with enough stone grit still mixed in that eating it is actively wearing down your tooth enamel with each bite. This bread will eventually contribute to the severe dental problems that plague ancient Egyptians, turning even young workers into people with mouths full of broken, infected teeth that cause constant low-grade facial pain that's just accepted as normal, because dentistry won't be meaningfully invented for another few thousand years. Alongside the bread, you receive exactly 3 small onions, raw, unwashed, still covered in Nile mud, and a small portion of dried fish that smells like it died during a previous dynasty and has been preserved through the mummification process, except nobody bothered with the fancy oils and rituals. The fish is so desiccated and salt-encrusted that eating it requires first softening it in your mouth like some kind of ancient jerky. And the taste is exactly what you'd imagine death would taste like if death was also a seafood product. This is your midday meal, representing perhaps 500 calories that will somehow need to fuel another 6 hours of the same back-breaking labor you just completed. And you're expected to be grateful for it because the alternative is not eating at all and discovering exactly how quickly a working human body can consume itself when deprived of adequate nutrition. Around you, workers are eating in mechanical silence, their movements automatic and joyless, faces slack with exhaustion that goes beyond physical into something approaching existential despair. Some men have injuries visible even through their dust-covered skin. Gashes, bruises, rope burns, heat blisters. And there's zero medical attention available beyond rinsing wounds in the same contaminated Nile water that's probably introducing more infections than it's preventing. You notice that several workers aren't eating at all, but are instead lying completely still in whatever shade they've claimed, their chests barely rising and falling. And you can't tell if they're conserving energy, unconscious from heat stroke, or actually dead because in the chaotic aftermath of the morning shift, nobody's bothering to check. The overseers are having their own lunch about 50 yards away, sitting under a proper linen canopy with actual furniture, wooden stools and small tables. And their meal looks suspiciously more appetizing than what the workers received. You can see roasted meat, what appears to be fresh fruit, and ceramic vessels probably containing beer or wine. Because apparently the class divide in ancient Egypt extends all the way down to lunch distribution. They're laughing and talking, completely comfortable despite the heat that's currently destroying everyone else. And you realize they've probably built up tolerance to these conditions over years of supervising while workers like you are expected to adapt or die trying. The 30-minute lunch break is ticking away while you're trying to force down food that your exhausted digestive system really doesn't want to process. And you're acutely aware that the moment the gong sounds again, you'll be expected to return to full capacity despite the fact that your body is currently lobbying for you to lie down and never move again. The afternoon shift begins with your body already operating at a deficit that would hospitalize a modern person. And the tasks ahead require precision and coordination that seem impossible when you can barely keep your vision focused and your legs steady. Your team is now responsible for using wooden levers and makeshift fulcrums to tilt your stone block up a mud brick ramp, a process that's essentially controlled chaos, where one mistake means several tons of limestone rolling backward and crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be in its path. The physics of ancient levers are deceptively simple in theory, but absolutely brutal in practice. You're using long wooden poles wedged under the stone block's edge, with smaller rocks serving as fulcrum points. And then multiple men push down on the lever arm with all their combined weight to lift the opposite end of the stone by a few precious inches. While the stone is elevated, other workers frantically shove supporting blocks underneath to prevent it from falling. And this entire operation has to happen in perfect synchronization, or people die in extremely unpleasant ways involving several tons of rock and the sudden conversion of three-dimensional human bodies into two-dimensional art projects. You've already seen evidence of previous accidents. There are dark stains on the ramps and work areas that could be old blood or spilled materials. But given the number of workers limping or missing digits, you're betting on blood. The foreman is demonstrating the technique on a practice stone, his movements efficient and clearly honed through years of not dying while doing this job. And he makes it look almost manageable until you actually try it yourself and discover that pushing down on a wooden lever hard enough to lift thousands of pounds requires generating force that your malnourished, dehydrated, exhausted body simply cannot produce without borrowing strength from future you. Who's going to be really pissed about this loan when the bill comes due? Your team positions the first lever, sets the fulcrum point, and on the count of 3, 10 men push down with everything they have while simultaneously screaming, because apparently making noise helps convince the stone to cooperate. Though this might just be a psychological coping mechanism to distract from the fact that you're all risking death for a building project that none of you will ever personally benefit from. The stone lifts maybe 2 inches. Support blocks get shoved underneath by workers who have to stick their hands into a gap that could close and pulverize their fingers if the lever slips. And then everyone releases and resets for the next lift. 2 inches of progress per cycle, and you need to elevate the stone 6 feet, which translates to 36 cycles of this particular form of torture before you can even begin the process of sliding the stone into its final position. The mathematics of suffering keep getting worse the more you understand them. And somewhere around lift number 5, your body starts making executive decisions without consulting your brain. Your vision tunnels, your hearing goes slightly muffled, and you're pretty sure you're experiencing the early stages of heat stroke. But there's no stopping because the overseer is right there with his whip and his complete lack of interest in your physiological limitations. Around you, other teams are engaged in the same desperate struggle, and the afternoon air is filled with the sound of wooden levers creaking under impossible strain, stones scraping against supporting blocks, and the occasional sharp crack followed by screaming when a lever breaks or slips and someone pays the immediate price for ancient engineering's fundamental lack of safety margins. By 3 in the afternoon, the sun has transformed the construction site into what can only be described as the surface of a hostile alien planet where humans weren't meant to survive. And the temperature is hovering somewhere around 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the direct sun, with absolutely zero relief available anywhere within your visual range. The heat is no longer just uncomfortable. It's actively hostile, attacking your body's ability to regulate its own temperature, and slowly cooking your internal organs in ways that won't become fully apparent until tonight, when you try to sleep and discover that your kidneys have basically gone on strike. Your team has managed to elevate the stone block approximately 4 feet up the mud brick ramp through sheer stubborn refusal to die. And the final 2 feet of elevation require an even more terrifying technique, where the stone needs to be tilted nearly 45 degrees while being simultaneously pushed forward, creating a scenario where if anything slips, thousands of pounds of limestone will slide backward down the ramp and turn everyone in its path into a historical footnote about construction accidents in ancient Egypt. The overseer has brought in additional workers from other completed teams to help with this final push, because apparently your specific stone block is running behind schedule, and management has decided that throwing more bodies at the problem is the solution rather than, say, acknowledging that the schedule was unrealistic from the start. You're now part of a crew of 30 men, all positioning themselves around the stone like ants trying to move a breadcrumb that's orders of magnitude larger than any individual ant. And the foreman is shouting increasingly creative threats about what happens to teams that fail to complete their assignments before the evening gong sounds. The technique involves half the team using levers on the lower edge to tilt the stone, while the other half pushes on the upper edge to drive it forward, all while maintaining enough control that the stone doesn't simply tip over the edge of the ramp and plummet to the ground below. taking several workers with it in a catastrophic failure that would be tragic if anyone cared about individual worker deaths. On the foreman's count, everyone engages simultaneously, levers pushing, hands gripping, feet digging into the crumbling mud brick of the ramp. And the stone tilts with a grinding sound that suggests the laws of physics are seriously questioning whether they want to participate in this madness. The angle increases past 30 degrees, past 35, approaching 40, and you can feel the weight distribution shifting in ways that make your lizard brain scream warnings about imminent disaster. But there's no stopping once this process begins, because halfway through a tilt is the most dangerous position where the stone could slip in any direction and cause maximum carnage. Your hands are gripping a wooden lever that's slick with sweat and blood. Your arms are shaking with the effort of maintaining pressure. And you can feel the wood starting to flex and bow under the load in ways that suggest it's approaching its structural limits and might explode into splinters at any moment, sending shrapnel into everyone nearby and probably causing the stone to fall in whatever direction physics decides is most entertaining. The moment stretches into eternity. That frozen second before disaster either strikes or narrowly avoids you. And then the stone shifts, settles onto its new supporting position, and everyone simultaneously releases while stumbling backward because your muscles have been locked in maximum contraction for so long they've forgotten how to do anything else. The final phase of stone placement involves sliding your block into its precise position in the wall. And this is where you discover that ancient Egyptian engineering requires millimeter precision, despite using tools and techniques that would make a modern contractor laugh until they cried. The stone needs to fit seamlessly against its neighbors, creating a wall face that's flush enough to satisfy the architects who inspect everything with wooden measuring tools and unforgiving standards, because this is a religious monument that will theoretically last for eternity, and shoddy workmanship might anger the gods. Your exhausted team has to use wooden rollers, rope, and pure muscle power to shift thousands of pounds of limestone with a kind of fine control that seems impossible when your hands are shaking from exhaustion and your vision is starting to develop black spots that suggest your brain isn't receiving adequate oxygen. The process involves placing cylindrical wooden rollers under the stone, then using ropes to pull it forward, while other workers use wooden poles to guide and adjust the trajectory. All while a specialist stands nearby calling out measurements and adjustments in a language that's half ancient Egyptian and half what can only be described as construction site profanity. Every few inches of movement requires stopping to check alignment, because if the stone goes into position even slightly wrong, you'll have to lever it back out and start over. And nobody wants to face the overseer's reaction to that level of failure after spending an entire day getting the stone to this point. The stone finally slides into position with a grinding sound that indicates it's making contact with its neighbors. And the specialist moves in with his measuring tools, wooden squares and string lines, to verify that everything is flush, level, and exactly where the plans specify. There's a moment of terrible suspense where everyone holds their breath, because if this placement fails inspection, the next few hours will be spent repeating the entire process, except now you'll be doing it with whatever energy reserves exist beyond complete physical collapse. The specialist nods approval, makes some kind of mark in a clay tablet that probably records your team's completion of the task. And just like that, you're done with your first stone. One stone placed in a temple that will eventually contain thousands of stones. And your entire day of suffering has contributed exactly one building block to a monument that will outlast your civilization. The evening gong sound across the construction site, signaling the end of the workday, and workers begin the slow shuffle back toward the barracks with the enthusiasm of soldiers retreating from a battlefield. They didn't win, but at least survived. Your body is providing a comprehensive catalog of everything that's gone wrong during the past 12 hours. Your hands are destroyed. Your back is screaming. Your shoulders feel dislocated. Your feet are covered in cuts and blisters. You're severely dehydrated despite drinking contaminated water all day. And you're pretty sure you've developed the beginning stages of heat stroke that will make tonight's sleep absolutely miserable. Around you, workers are in similar condition, some limping, some being supported by friends, some moving with the mechanical efficiency of people who've learned to ignore their body's distress signals because acknowledging them doesn't change anything. The sun is finally starting to descend toward the horizon, providing the first relief from the heat that's been attacking you since dawn. But the temperature will remain above 90 degrees well into the night, and the barracks will be absolutely stifling until long after midnight, when you're supposed to be recovering for tomorrow's shift that will be exactly as brutal as today. This was day 1, and you have approximately 119 more days to go before the flood season ends and you're released back to your farm. Assuming you survive that long without dying from injury, disease, or the accumulated effects of malnutrition and exhaustion. The evening meal is distributed with the same enthusiasm as a funeral director handing out condolence cards. And what arrives in your clay bowl makes lunch look like a feast prepared by chefs who actually cared about their craft. You're given another portion of that coarse emmer wheat bread that's been grinding down your tooth enamel all day. Except this time it's been sitting in the sun for hours and has achieved a texture somewhere between stale cardboard and actual stone, requiring you to soften it in your mouth for several minutes before your jaw muscles can generate enough force to chew it without breaking teeth. Alongside the bread comes a watery lentil stew that contains approximately 7 lentils floating in what appears to be yesterday's dishwater. Seasoned with a faint memory of salt and the overwhelming presence of sand that's somehow gotten into everything despite the cook's theoretical best efforts. There's also a small portion of beer. And before you get excited, ancient Egyptian beer is nothing like the craft IPAs you might be imagining. This is a thick, barely fermented sludge made from partially baked bread dissolved in water, with a consistency like chunky gravy and an alcohol content barely strong enough to kill some of the bacteria swimming around in the liquid. It tastes like wet bread mixed with vinegar and disappointment. But it's the closest thing to safe drinking water available, because the fermentation process has at least reduced some of the pathogen load that makes straight Nile water a guaranteed express ticket to dysentery. You're sitting in the barracks courtyard with several hundred other workers, everyone eating in exhausted silence, punctuated only by the occasional groan when someone shifts position and discovers a new injury they hadn't cataloged yet. The social dynamics of the worker camp are starting to become apparent now that you're paying attention. There are definite hierarchies based on experience, strength, and cunning, with veteran workers who've survived multiple building seasons forming unofficial crews that look out for each other and share information about which overseers are merely brutal versus actually psychotic. The new workers like you are at the bottom of this hierarchy, considered expendable until you prove you can survive long enough to be worth investing friendship in. Because making friends with someone who might be dead in a week is an emotional luxury nobody here can afford. You're learning names despite yourself. There's Kenty, a wiry man in his 30s who's been doing this for 5 seasons and has the scarred hands and broken teeth to prove it. And he's explaining in between mouthfuls of terrible bread that the secret to survival is pacing yourself and never volunteering for anything, because enthusiasm gets interpreted as having energy to spare and results in being assigned extra work. There's also Bakenkunsu, a younger guy maybe your age who arrived 2 weeks ago and is already showing signs of not making it through the season. He's developed a cough that suggests his lungs are losing their battle with limestone dust, and his eyes have that glassy quality that indicates fever, probably from one of the dozens of infections constantly circulating through a camp, where hundreds of men share contaminated water and sleep in conditions that would horrify modern epidemiologists. The evening air is still oppressively hot despite the sun setting. And the barracks are going to be absolutely stifling tonight, trapping the day's accumulated heat in mud brick walls that will radiate warmth all night long, like sleeping inside an oven that's been turned off but hasn't cooled down yet. Some workers are already lying on their reed mats, too exhausted to even finish eating. And you can hear the sounds of men coughing, groaning, and occasionally crying quietly in the darkness, because breaking down emotionally is one of the few releases available when your body is being systematically destroyed. And there's no escape except death or the end of the flood season, whichever comes first. Sleep in ancient Egypt is less a peaceful restoration of mind and body, and more a desperate, unconscious state your brain forces upon you despite the absolutely miserable conditions, making actual rest nearly impossible. The barracks at night are a symphony of human suffering, men coughing up limestone dust that's been accumulating in their lungs all day, others moaning in their sleep as their bodies process the day's injuries, some crying out from nightmares that are probably no worse than their waking reality, and everyone collectively producing enough body heat to raise the ambient temperature several degrees beyond what the already stifling mud brick structure was naturally maintaining. The fleas are in peak feeding mode once the sun goes down, biting with such enthusiasm that you're fairly certain they're having some kind of feast celebration at your expense. And scratching the bites only spreads whatever bacteria your contaminated fingernails are carrying, virtually guaranteeing that by tomorrow you'll have infected welts to add to your growing collection of medical problems. Your reed mat provides absolutely zero cushioning between your destroyed body and the packed earth floor, meaning every pressure point, shoulders, hips, knees, is making direct contact with ground that might as well be concrete. And finding a comfortable sleeping position is impossible because every position puts weight on some part of your body that's been damaged during the day's labor. Your hands are throbbing with a deep, aching pain that suggests the damage goes beyond surface wounds into actual nerve trauma. Your back is locked in what feels like a permanent spasm that makes breathing deeply, actively painful. And your shoulders are so inflamed that lifting your arms above your head would probably make you pass out from the pain. Around 3 in the morning, you're awakened by someone stumbling over you in the darkness on their way to the waste trench. Because apparently even exhaustion can't override the body's need to expel the questionable food and water you've been consuming. And intestinal distress is just another normal feature of worker camp life. The waste trenches are located about 50 yards from the barracks, far enough that the smell is theoretically manageable, but close enough that on hot nights with the wrong wind direction, you're basically sleeping in a latrine. And they're exactly what you'd imagine. long ditches dug into the ground where hundreds of men squat to relieve themselves, creating a biohazard that would make modern sanitation workers quit their jobs in protest. There's no toilet paper because that won't be invented for another few millennia. So workers use whatever's available, usually sand, small stones, or broken pottery shards. And the resulting infections and hemorrhoids are so common that having a healthy digestive system and intact anal tissue marks you as either brand new or supernaturally lucky. You eventually drift back into something approximating sleep, though it's more like a series of brief, unconscious periods interrupted by pain, itching, heat, and the general misery of your circumstances. And when that copper gong sounds again at 4:30 in the morning to signal the start of day 2, you've maybe accumulated 3 hours of actual rest scattered across an 8-hour period of lying on the ground, hoping for unconsciousness. The realization hits you with devastating clarity. This is day 2 of 120, and your body is already operating at a severe deficit that will only worsen with each passing day unless something changes. Except nothing's going to change, because this is just how ancient Egyptian construction works, and the monuments you're building will be admired by tourists 3,000 years from now who have absolutely no concept of the human cost involved in creating them. Day 2 begins with your body sending very clear signals that it would prefer to be dead rather than endure another 12 hours of what happened yesterday. But unfortunately, you're still breathing. So the overseers consider you fit for duty, and that's the end of that particular negotiation. The morning routine is identical to yesterday. The copper gong, the stumbling exodus from the barracks, the terrible gruel, the gathering at workstations. Except now you're doing it with injuries that haven't healed and exhaustion that's accumulated rather than resolved, which means you're starting today's marathon already several miles behind where you started yesterday. Your team has been assigned a new stone block, because apparently 1 stone per day is the expected quota for teams of 20 men. And this mathematical reality means you'll need to successfully complete 120 stone placements before you're released from service, assuming you survive that long without being crushed, dying from heat stroke, or succumbing to one of the numerous infectious diseases constantly circulating through the camp. The new stone is waiting in the quarry, and your team makes the walk back to that dust-choked hellhole with all the enthusiasm of prisoners heading to the gallows. And when you arrive, you discover that today's stone is somehow even larger than yesterday's, because apparently the construction plan calls for progressively bigger blocks as the walls rise higher, creating an escalating challenge that seems specifically designed to kill workers through incremental difficulty increases. This stone looks like it weighs closer to 3 tons, and the foreman is already explaining the modified technique required to move it. More men on the ropes, different rope configurations, additional wooden rollers, and a timeline that's somehow even more aggressive than yesterday, despite the increased weight. The mathematics of human endurance don't support what's being asked of you. But ancient Egyptian construction management operates on the principle that human limitations are just obstacles to be overcome through motivation provided by copper-tipped whips and the threat of having your family's land allotment revoked if you fail to meet quotas. Your hands are barely functional this morning. The blisters from yesterday have popped and are now open wounds that immediately start bleeding again the moment you grip the rope. And wrapping them in cloth only provides the illusion of protection, because within minutes the cloth is soaked through with blood and basically just creating a bacteria-laden compress that's actively encouraging infection. But there's no medical exemption for damaged hands, no light-duty option for workers who are injured, No acknowledgement that asking someone with open wounds to pull rope for 12 hours might be medically problematic. You either work or you're replaced. And replacement in this context means being sent back to your village in disgrace with no compensation for the days you did work, and your family losing their flood season support payments that they were counting on to survive until next year's harvest. So you grip the rope with your destroyed hands and you pull, because the alternative is worse. And this is how civilizations build monuments that last for millennia. By finding the exact point where death is worse than continuing to work and then keeping workers precisely at that boundary for months at a time. The stone begins to move with the same grinding reluctance as yesterday, and you settle into the rhythm of pull, reset, knowing that you'll repeat this cycle roughly 1,000 times today, and that each repetition is actively shortening your lifespan in ways that won't become apparent until you're 40 years old and dying from complications that modern doctors would immediately recognize as chronic occupational disease. The mid-morning sun is already approaching its daily mission of making everyone regret being alive. And your team is only about 1/3 of the way through today's stone hauling journey when the first casualty occurs. One of the rope pullers suddenly releases his grip, staggers sideways like he's been shot, and collapses face first into the limestone dust without any warning or dramatic final words. His name was Seneb. You'd learned during breakfast, when he'd mentioned this was his 3rd season and he'd survived 2 previous building projects, which apparently means absolutely nothing when your body decides it's had enough and simply shuts down despite your brain's desperate desire to continue. The other workers barely pause. 2 men drag Seneb off to the side of the path, check if he's breathing, discover that he's not, and return to the rope within maybe 2 minutes because the stone doesn't care about individual deaths and the overseers certainly don't care. And stopping work to properly mourn or even investigate what killed him would require acknowledging that workers are humans rather than replaceable equipment. You're pulling rope and watching Seneb's body lying motionless about 20 feet away. And the psychological impact of witnessing casual death is profound in ways you hadn't anticipated. He was alive 90 seconds ago, probably worried about the same things you're worried about, like surviving the day, and whether tonight's dinner would be slightly less terrible than yesterday's. And now he's just meat cooling in the sun, while flies are already gathering because decomposition doesn't wait for convenient processing times. The cause of death is anyone's guess. Heat stroke, heart failure, aneurysm, or just the accumulated effects of malnutrition and exhaustion finally exceeding what his cardiovascular system could handle. But you'll never know, because ancient Egypt doesn't conduct autopsies on dead workers any more than modern people conduct detailed investigations when livestock die. His body will be collected at the end of the day, probably given a minimal burial in the workers' cemetery. And his family back in whatever village he came from will eventually receive word that he died in service to the pharaoh, which is supposed to be an honor, but doesn't actually help them survive the loss of their primary income earner. The stone keeps moving, the sun keeps climbing, and you keep pulling despite the fact that you just watched a veteran worker with more experience than you simply drop dead without warning. Which suggests that experience and survival skills only delay the inevitable rather than preventing it. Your mind is doing that thing where it tries to calculate odds. If someone dies roughly once per week per 100 workers, and there are approximately 3,000 workers on this site, that's about 30 deaths per week, which means by the end of the 4-month building season, roughly 500 workers will die for this single temple project. 500 humans who had families, lives, dreams, and plans, all converted into corpses in service of a building that will eventually become a tourist attraction, where guides will talk about the architectural achievements without mentioning that it was built on a foundation of bodies that were considered too insignificant to even record their names. The mathematics of ancient construction are written in blood, sweat, and the casual acceptance that some percentage of workers will simply not survive the project. And this mortality rate is so normal that it's probably factored into the planning stages, the same way modern construction projects budget for equipment depreciation. The afternoon brings a new form of torture that you hadn't adequately anticipated. The accumulated effects of working in extreme heat for multiple days starts manifesting as something beyond normal fatigue and enters the territory of actual medical emergency that's being ignored because the alternative would require acknowledging that humans have physical limits. Your kidneys are beginning to fail from chronic dehydration combined with heat stress, manifesting as a deep, aching pain in your lower back that's different from the muscular pain you've been experiencing. And your urine has taken on a dark amber color that suggests your body is desperately trying to conserve water by concentrating waste products to levels that would make a modern doctor immediately order IV fluids and rest. But there are no IV fluids in 1300 BCE, no understanding of kidney function or the importance of electrolyte balance. Just a vague awareness that workers who stop producing urine usually die within a few days, and therefore you should probably try to keep drinking the contaminated water, even if it makes you feel worse in the short term. The water situation is becoming increasingly desperate as the afternoon progresses. The ceramic jars stationed along the work route are emptying faster than they can be refilled. And by 2 in the afternoon, you're waiting in a line of 30 men just to get a single handful of water that's been sitting in the sun for hours and is now blood warm and tasting strongly of clay and whatever diseases the previous 200 men who drank from it were carrying. Some workers have given up on the official water supply and are sneaking down to the Nile during brief moments when overseers aren't watching, drinking directly from the river despite the fact that it's contaminated with sewage from villages upstream, agricultural runoff, and probably several dead animals that are currently decomposing in the water supply. The Nile water is arguably more dangerous than the ceramic jar water, but at least it's cool and abundant. And when you're experiencing the kind of thirst that makes your tongue feel like sandpaper and your throat feel like it's closing up, the risk of dysentery seems like a fair trade for immediate relief. You watch a worker named Zhao take this gamble, and within 3 hours, he's squatting at the waste trenches with explosive diarrhea that's going to dehydrate him even faster than the heat was already achieving, creating a vicious cycle where the solution to dehydration causes more dehydration, and there's no medical intervention available, beyond hoping his body can somehow fight off whatever pathogen he just introduced. The construction site is starting to look like a battlefield by mid-afternoon. Workers stumbling rather than walking, several men lying in whatever shade they can find because they've hit their absolute limit and have decided that accepting a beating from overseers is preferable to continuing, and the constant background noise of people vomiting, coughing, and groaning creates an atmosphere that's less construction site and more mass casualty event. But the work continues because the stones don't care about human suffering, and the Pharaoh's deadline doesn't adjust for inconvenient things like workers dying or becoming too sick to function effectively. Your team finally gets your stone to the construction site around 3 in the afternoon, and you're assigned to help with the lever work despite the fact that your hands are barely functional and your arms are shaking with the kind of tremor that suggests your nervous system is starting to misfire from exhaustion and metabolic imbalance. The evening brings no relief, only a different flavor of suffering as your body transitions from active destruction to passive deterioration while you're supposedly resting. Tonight's dinner is somehow even worse than yesterday's. The bread has achieved a consistency that requires actual carpentry tools to break apart. The lentil stew has been diluted even further to stretch supplies because apparently several workers have died, and management's solution is to maintain the same total food supply, despite unchanged number of living workers needing to eat. And the beer has gone slightly off in the heat, adding a sour fermented note that suggests it's now more vinegar than alcohol. You're eating mechanically because your body needs calories, even if your mind is completely uninterested in the process. And around you, the social fabric of the worker camp is starting to show serious fraying as exhaustion and suffering erode people's ability to maintain basic human decency. There are arguments breaking out over sleeping positions. Someone's mat is encroaching on someone else's space by a few inches, and this territorial violation is apparently worth fighting about when you're this miserable. And the arguments occasionally escalate to actual violence, with men throwing weak, exhausted punches at each other, until they both collapse from the effort or someone intervenes. The overseers don't stop these fights unless they threaten to interfere with tomorrow's work schedule, operating under the philosophy that letting workers blow off steam through violence is cheaper than dealing with organized resistance or rebellion. And honestly, the workers are too exhausted to rebel effectively anyway. So it's a calculated risk that usually pays off for management. You've started noticing the different survival strategies people are employing. Some workers are hoarding extra food by stealing from others' bowls when backs are turned, creating a microeconomy of desperation where the strong steal from the weak and everyone's baseline misery increases slightly. Others are forming protection alliances, small groups that watch each other's backs and share resources. And you're starting to realize that integrating into one of these groups might be essential for surviving the next 118 days because lone workers are vulnerable to theft, violence, and being blamed for problems that were actually caused by others. Kenty, the veteran worker you met yesterday, approaches you after dinner with a proposition. His group has an opening because one of their members died today. Different guy than Seneb, but same basic story of body shutting down without warning. And they're willing to bring you in if you're willing to contribute your share of resources and watch out for the others when they're vulnerable. It's a medieval guild system adapted for Bronze Age construction, creating mini safety nets in an environment that provides zero official support. And you accept immediately because the alternative is trying to survive alone in a place where being alone means being prey. The group consists of 5 workers, now including you. Kenty the veteran, Bakenkonsu, who's still coughing but hasn't died yet. Amenhotep, who's massive and strong enough to intimidate potential thieves. Nakht, who's clever and good at spotting overseer patterns to minimize whippings. And you, the new guy who brings nothing to the table except a desperate willingness to cooperate. This alliance won't save you from heat stroke or falling stones, but it might prevent you from getting your food stolen or being falsely accused of sabotage when tools go missing. And in ancient Egypt, that's about as good as workers' safety nets get. Day 3 begins with your body staging a comprehensive rebellion against the concept of consciousness. And you spend the first 5 minutes after the copper gong sounds simply trying to convince your arms and legs that yes, we are doing this again. And no, your complaints are not being taken into consideration by management. The infection in your hands has officially arrived. The open wounds from rope burns have developed the telltale angry red streaks radiating outward that suggest bacteria are throwing a party in your tissue. And the pain has progressed from sharp stinging to a deep throbbing ache that pulses in rhythm with your heartbeat. Modern antibiotics would clear this infection in a week. But modern antibiotics are roughly 3,000 years away from being discovered. So your immune system is going to have to fight this battle alone, while simultaneously dealing with malnutrition, exhaustion, heat stress, and whatever other diseases are incubating in your body. The morning routine has become mechanical. You move through it like a robot whose programming is degrading, going through the motions of eating terrible food and walking to the work site while your conscious mind has essentially checked out and is spending its time imagining what your funeral will look like when you inevitably join the dozens of other workers who've died during this project. Today's stone assignment is back at the quarry, and you're starting to recognize the rhythm of the work. One day hauling stone from quarry to site, next day doing the precision placement work, then back to the quarry for another stone, creating a cycle that will repeat 60 times before you're released from service. The quarry is somehow even more hellish today because they've gone deeper into the rock face overnight, creating a pit that traps heat like a natural oven and reduces air circulation to the point where breathing feels like inhaling from a hairdryer. The stone cutters working at the bottom of this pit are covered head to toe in white limestone dust, their skin, hair, and clothing completely coated so they look like ghosts laboring in their own tomb. And the coughing coming from them sounds like the death rattle of people whose lungs have been converted into stone through constant dust inhalation. You learn from Kenty that stone cutters have the shortest life expectancy of any worker on site. Most survive maybe 2 seasons before their lungs simply give up and they drown in their own fluids while still alive. And the position is considered so dangerous that it's used as punishment for workers who've committed serious infractions like theft or assault. Your team is assigned a stone that's been freshly cut, still warm from the friction of copper chisels. And the foreman is explaining that this particular block needs to reach the construction site before noon because it's part of a critical load-bearing section, and delays will cause problems for multiple other teams whose work depends on this stone being in position. The pressure is different today. You're not just hauling stone for abstract architectural reasons. You're directly impacting other workers' schedules. And failure means you'll be blamed for cascading delays that affect dozens of people who already hate you for being new and incompetent. The mathematics of collective punishment in ancient Egypt are brutal. If your team fails, everyone on the team gets beaten, which means your teammates have a vested interest in your success and will absolutely destroy you if you're the weak link that causes everyone to suffer. The midday crisis arrives right on schedule when your team is about halfway to the construction site and the rope configuration fails in the most spectacular way possible. One of the papyrus ropes that's been under constant tension for hours suddenly snaps with a sound like a whip crack, and the immediate release of tension causes everyone holding that section to stumble backward while the stone lurches sideways on its wooden sledge. The chaotic physics of this moment unfold in slow motion. The stone is tilting, the sledge is skewing, and several workers are directly in the path of thousands of pounds of limestone that's no longer under controlled movement. Someone screams, everyone scrambles, and by pure luck, nobody gets crushed when the stone settles at a 45-degree angle that's completely wrong, but at least not fatal to anyone. The foreman arrives within seconds, his face showing an expression that suggests he's deciding whether to beat everyone immediately or wait until after the stone is recovered. And after a tense moment, he chooses efficiency over punishment and starts barking orders about how to right the stone without making things worse. The recovery process requires double the manpower because you're essentially starting from a disadvantaged position. The stone needs to be levered back onto the sledge properly, which means the lever work you thought you'd do this afternoon is now happening in the unforgiving midday sun while you're already exhausted from the morning's hauling. Workers from other teams are diverted to help because your failure is now affecting the entire site's schedule exactly as predicted. And you can feel the waves of resentment radiating from people who are having a terrible day already and now have to deal with your team's incompetence. The process takes over an hour, carefully levering, adjusting, supporting, repositioning. And by the time the stone is finally back on its sledge and ready to continue moving, you've lost so much time that making the noon deadline is mathematically impossible unless your team can somehow move the stone faster than physically achievable. The foreman's solution is exactly what you'd expect. He starts using his whip not as threat, but as active motivation, striking workers who he perceives as moving too slowly. And the work becomes a desperate sprint where you're pulling rope with bleeding, infected hands, while your back screams and your vision tunnels, and somewhere in your peripheral awareness, you can hear Bakankonsu coughing so hard he's bringing up blood. The stone moves faster than it safely should. The wooden rollers are being positioned with less precision, because precision takes time you don't have. And there's a very real possibility that someone's going to get their foot crushed when a roller shifts unexpectedly, or hand mangled when they're too slow pulling away after positioning supports. You make the deadline by approximately 3 minutes, arriving at the construction site just before the noon position is given to another team. And the collective relief is so intense that several workers simply collapse where they stand because adrenaline is the only thing that's been keeping them upright. And now that the crisis has passed, their bodies are cashing in all those borrowed energy checks. The foreman notes your team's success in his clay tablet, making no mention of the rope failure or the recovery time, or the fact that success was achieved through injury and suffering rather than competent planning, because the only metric that matters in ancient Egypt is whether the stone arrived on schedule, and the answer is technically yes, so everything else is irrelevant details. The afternoon placement work becomes an exercise in forcing your body to perform precision tasks when every system is shutting down from exhaustion, infection, and heat stress. And the results are predictably catastrophic in small ways that could become catastrophic in large ways if you're not extremely careful. Your hands are now so infected that gripping anything causes immediate sharp pain that makes your vision white out at the edges. And the pus leaking from the wounds is creating a slippery coating that makes maintaining grip on wooden levers nearly impossible. The placement specialist takes one look at your hands, makes a disgusted sound that suggests you're personally offensive to him, and assigns you to be a support worker rather than a lever operator. Your job is to position the wooden support blocks under the stone during the lifting process, which means sticking your destroyed hands into the gap between thousands of pounds of limestone and the ground, trusting that your teammates won't slip and drop the stone on your fingers. The first lift goes fine. The stone elevates by 2 inches. You shove the support block into position and pull your hands back with milliseconds to spare. And everyone resets for the next lift. The second lift is where problems start. One of the lever operators is Bakenkansu, who's coughing so hard he can barely maintain pressure on the lever. And when the stone is at maximum elevation, his grip fails and the lever slips. The stone drops suddenly, not the full height, but enough that it comes down hard on the support blocks, and your hands are barely clear when impact happens. You estimate you pulled them back maybe 1 second before they would have been crushed into paste between stone and ground. The adrenaline surge from near death is so intense that you can taste copper in your mouth, and your vision goes spotty with what might be shock or might be your blood pressure doing something extremely problematic. And you're vaguely aware that you're shaking so hard that the placement specialist is yelling at you to get control of yourself because the work isn't stopping just because you almost died. The afternoon continues with this same level of desperate precision. Lift, place, nearly die, reset, repeat. And by the time the stone is finally in position and the specialist has verified its alignment, you've had approximately 6 more near-death experiences that you'll probably have nightmares about, assuming you survive long enough to sleep tonight. Your hands have progressed beyond infected into what might be early stages of sepsis. You're developing chills despite the ambient temperature being well over 100 degrees. And there's a red line starting to track up your forearm from the infection site that suggests bacteria are making their way toward your bloodstream in ways that will become fatal within a few days if your immune system can't mount a successful defense. The evening gong sounds with the same blessed finality as yesterday, and you make the walk back to camp with your survival group, Kenty taking one look at your hands and shaking his head in a way that suggests he's seen this progression before, and it doesn't usually end well. He produces a small clay jar containing some kind of salve, probably animal fat mixed with honey and maybe some herbs that might have mild antimicrobial properties. And he smears it on your wounds while explaining that this either helps or it doesn't, but doing nothing guarantees death, so you might as well try. The salve stings like someone's rubbing salt in the wounds, which might actually be accurate because salt preservation is a thing in Egypt. And you spend dinner trying not to think about the fact that you're 3 days into a 120-day assignment and your body is already showing signs of systemic infection that could kill you before the weekends. Day 4 begins with the grim realization that you're not going to make it to day 120. And this isn't pessimism, but rather a mathematical certainty based on the rate at which your body is deteriorating versus the time remaining in your service obligation. The infection in your hands has spread to the point where you can see red lines tracking up both arms toward your torso, and you're experiencing the kind of fever that makes the external heat feel almost cold by comparison, which is a very bad sign that suggests your internal temperature is approaching levels that start cooking proteins and causing brain damage. Your survival group is having an emergency meeting before the workday starts, discussing whether you're going to be able to work today or whether you've crossed the threshold into genuinely unable to function. And the stakes of this determination are brutal. If you can't work, you'll be sent back to your village without completing your service obligation. Your family loses their flood season support, and you probably die on the journey home because the infection will continue progressing without any additional medical intervention. If you try to work despite being genuinely incapacitated, you'll either die on site or cause an accident that injures or kills teammates, which means they have a vested interest in honestly assessing your capability rather than letting you work out of sympathy. Kenty makes the call. You're staying in the barracks today, They'll cover for your absence by claiming you're on latrine duty or moving supplies or some other task that would plausibly keep you away from the main work site. And if anyone checks, you're to pretend you've been reassigned. This deception is risky because if discovered, it means collective punishment for the entire group. But apparently they've decided you're worth saving despite having known you for less than a week, which is either touching evidence of human kindness or pragmatic calculation that they've invested resources in you and want to see if you'll survive to pay them back. You spend day 4 lying on your reed mat in the empty barracks, drifting in and out of feverish consciousness, while your immune system wages total war against the bacterial invasion. The experience is hallucinatory. You dream about stone blocks that talk, overseers who are literal demons with whips made of fire. And at one point, you're convinced you've died and are being judged by Egyptian gods who are unimpressed with your 3 days of stone hauling and are debating whether to let you into the afterlife or just recycle your soul into something more useful, like a particularly competent donkey. When consciousness returns properly around midday, you discover that your fever has broken. You're absolutely soaked with sweat, severely dehydrated, and weak as a newborn. But the red lines on your arms have stopped advancing and maybe even retreated slightly, suggesting your immune system has managed to achieve something resembling a stalemate with the infection. This is the closest thing to a miracle you're going to experience in ancient Egypt. Your body has somehow fought off what should have been a fatal infection using nothing but its own resources and whatever marginal benefit Kenti's honey salve provided. You survive day 4, and while you're still dangerously weak and will need several more days of recovery before you can return to full work duty, the immediate crisis has passed, and you've learned a crucial lesson about Bronze Age survival. Sometimes the human body is capable of extraordinary things when the alternative is death. And sometimes sheer stubborn refusal to die is enough to carry you through situations that should be fatal. Your survival group returns that evening, and Kenti's face when he sees you're conscious and lucid shows genuine relief mixed with surprise. Because apparently he was genuinely uncertain whether you'd live through the day. Amenhotep produces an extra portion of dinner stolen from somewhere you don't ask. And the group shares a moment of quiet satisfaction that their gamble paid off, and you might actually survive long enough to be useful. You've made it through 4 days of ancient Egyptian construction work. And while you're currently too weak to move stones or pull ropes, you're alive. Which in this context is the absolute best outcome anyone could realistically hope for. The next 116 days stretch ahead of you like an endless desert. But at least now you know that survival is possible. Difficult, painful, and requiring equal parts luck and determination, but possible.